Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining. Thank you for your interest in my stories. I really appreciate the opportunity to share them, and thank you for your interest more generally in how do we regenerate the world. What does it take? So I appreciate you showing up for that here and elsewhere. So my interest and what brings me to this conversation is 20 years of exploring, kind of like you were saying, Teresa, and Jeff as well. How do we move beyond the linear, reductionist, mechanistic story and ways of working, because it seems to be keeping us stuck in massive problems. Not only stuck, but they're getting worse. If I think about issues like poverty and homelessness and addiction and suicide and polarization, the more we work at them, the worse they seem to get over the course of my lifetime. So clearly something is wrong with our approach and with the thinking that goes into it. So I started to work at that, to try to understand, where did we get this story that we have now, and that guides all of our choices and designs and priorities, and what else is possible, and how could we move into that? And my instinct and my research at the time was pointing to a story that tells us everything in the universe operates like a machine, as we're noticing already. I'm going to share my screen just for emphasis. So we have this story that divides everything into separate parts, like academic departments, even if the world doesn't actually work that way. And that tells us that we're separate from each other, we're separate from nature, we're separate from our organizations. We're just human resources, human capital that are input into the machine that is the organization, and something else is spit out, some product is spit out the other end as output to a customer who's also separate from the machine. And they're waiting passively for this thing to be dropped into their laps, and the environment and biosphere don't even factor into that whole story. So this mechanistic story truly shapes every aspect of our lives, including agriculture, including how we understand our role in relationship with the land, and what makes sense, and how we design our food production systems. And so I and many other people have been looking for the rest of the story. Surely that's not all of who we are and all of how the world works. There seems to be at least another chapter, if not really the whole main plot of the story, that is that life actually operates, the world operates as an ecology of living systems. So this has been the focus of my work for the past 20 years, including writing a book called The Age of Thrivability, that documents the many signposts that were pointed in this direction, that I'm not the only one noticing this and talking about this, and that we are in many ways gaining momentum in moving towards an age of greater alignment with life, greater stewardship of life. And yet it's not guaranteed that we'll get there, because there's also that machine story that's still present and kind of pulling us back and separating us. So it's important to be in conversations like this one, to be intentional about moving into a new and better story that leads to better outcomes. So as part of sort of setting the big picture context, before I get into the stories, I want to just offer a little bit more detail about this transition from a machine story to a living system story. If we don't talk about this, and then we look at regenerative agriculture, then we're left just with a handful of methods. And as one of Jeff's other farming friends in Indiana said to me, and And, I don't really know if they work. And it's not about just these handful of techniques and whether or not they work. There's something much more fundamental that's behind this shift in how we think about agriculture. So I've got two charts that I find really helpful to express and portray the transition that's really going on. In this one, we have a spectrum of intentions and impacts. And at the left side of the spectrum, this is really where we still are. Most of our human activities are still pretty well grounded in conventional approaches that are driven by mechanistic design and worldview, reductionist thinking. And they are having a catastrophic impact, right? It's degenerative, and it's reducing our ability to thrive and to continue, for the whole living ecosystem to continue. And we're starting to recognize that. It's starting to become unavoidable to recognize that. And so some years ago, as some of us started to see that, we moved into green strategies and approaches. So we adopted recycling in an effort to be less bad, to do less damage. And as we saw that even that wasn't enough, we saw the rise of the sustainability movement in an effort to really stop the bleed and sustain things the way they are. And that has quite an engineering approach to it. Most of all, it's about the efficiency of our material use. And as we saw that even that wasn't enough, that we've done so much damage that we actually need to restore, we started to look at what lies beyond sustainability. And some of us saw then that we have the opportunity not only to restore, but to regenerate, to work with life's natural intrinsic patterns and propensities, that we can align with life in order to support its ability to regenerate itself wherever we find life, and we find it everywhere. So in agriculture, for example, the mechanistic story of industrial agriculture tells us that the farmer is the one growing the plants with his or her machines and chemicals, that it's really a question of chemistry and physics. And in contrast, regenerative agriculture tells us that the farmer is stewarding and cultivating the fertile conditions for the living soil to grow the plants. So it's a quite profoundly different strategy and approach. And it helps us see that this spectrum is not a timeline, and it's not a necessary progression, that we have to start from industrial and conventional approaches and then work our way through green and through sustainability. And if we get sustainability right, if we complete that stage, then we can move to restorative, and maybe eventually somewhere down the line we'll get to this utopian fantasy of regeneration. This is how a lot of people interpret this spectrum, and even without seeing it, that's part of the pushback that I often get. I haven't mastered sustainability yet, and you want me to think about regeneration. It's not a timeline, it's a fundamental shift in strategy. These are different strategies, and sustainability is sort of the tipping point and the holding place for the mechanistic story. So it's impossible for us to get from sustainability to regenerative without shifting the underlying thinking that drives it. We've got to adopt the new story in order to really understand what's required at this level. So let me offer one other chart to help make this clear. This is the same spectrum, just presented differently. In conventional approaches, we've got this very simple linear way of understanding things that takes us from taking, making, and wasting. And it's just kind of a straight line to waste. As we moved into green strategies, then we sought to delay that and to do slightly less harm and less bad. As we moved into the sustainability movement, sometimes now we're calling it the circular economy, that we want to try to keep it going as long as we can and minimize the waste. But we can never, with this mindset and this engineering approach, we can never fully eliminate it. So the move towards regeneration in agriculture and elsewhere is really a fundamentally different strategy that sees us aligning with life and its natural inherent patterns, and helps us see that only living systems can truly be sustainable. So some would put sustainability after regeneration. Once we can really embrace regenerative, life-aligned strategies, then humanity can truly be sustainable on the planet. All right. So these are different strategies. And the way I like to talk about it, before regeneration became a buzzword, I did use it because it is one of any living system's properties or characteristics. But I talk more often about thrivability, about supporting life's ability to thrive at every level, for individuals, for organizations as living ecosystems, for communities as living dynamic ecosystems, and for the biosphere. So our work, wherever we are focused, is to create the conditions for life to be able to thrive over time. And I think of it as this work of creating those fertile conditions as the informed intention and practice of thrivability. Informed because if we're going to create the conditions for life to thrive, we have to know, what does that mean? What does that involve? What does that require of us? So we have to get informed one way or another. And then we have to set that as our clear and explicit intention to enable life to thrive, because it's not right now. In most of society, we set our sights on something far less than life's ability to thrive. We set our sights on things like productivity and profitability, which aren't bad in themselves, but if that's the extent of our intention, then we see what trouble we get into. So I believe we need to get really clear and explicit that it's about aligning with life as the true bottom line. And then it's important to recognize that that's not a marketing campaign. It's not a certification that I'm going to send you all at the end of this time together. It's not one department within an organization. This is a life practice, an ongoing individual and collective practice in which we are continuously deepening in wisdom and compassion and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action. So it's like, it's a profound life practice. And that shows up wherever we are. I hear this from the farmers that I work with, that even though there's a very short list of methods that are, that form the core of what's understood to be regenerative agriculture, every piece of land is different, every season is different, every week is different. There's just so much learning that's needed about how to be in wise and compassionate relationship with your land and with your neighbors and each other, and how to learn together. So this practice, this informed intention and practice, shows up in my work as working with groups of farmers to help them understand this new relationship that they have with the land and with the soil, and to be in that practice and to be in that learning and practice with each other, and also with their broader community. I also work with regional and national tourism authorities in, would you believe, in Belgium and in Northern Ireland, not the Republic of Ireland, and in New Zealand. So in that case, it's helping to shift the way we understand tourism from being a conveyor belt, where the goal is just as many people throughput as possible, dropping as much money behind as they go through as possible, and instead seeing it as something that could be profoundly nourishing and nurturing to local communities, and an opportunity for them to come together in this informed intention and practice, and enable more thriving along the way. Jeff, you are a co-host. Can you let in whoever has just arrived, please? And I'll carry on. And speak up if you aren't able to, because I can't see you right now. All right, so I'd like to share what informs me in my work. If we start with this informed intention and practice, if we start with being informed, those 20 years ago, I went in search of what does it mean for life to thrive? What does it take to enable any living system to thrive, whether it's our bodies or an organization or a community or a rainforest? What are the universal design principles that we can work with? So I want to share the 4 principles that I discovered those 20 years ago and that I continue to work with and find really, really helpful. And that show up beautifully in soil. So we'll talk a bit about that as well. All right. So here they are, all at once, at a glance, and I'll describe them in a general sense, and then I'll give you a couple of examples to make them more concrete and real. So what we need to know about any thriving living system, if we're to support it and its ability to thrive, is that the living system has diverse parts, and the more diversity, the better. If it's to be creative and resilient and adaptive, those parts are connected and supported in patterns and structures of relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new level of life, a new emergent whole with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And that's the magic that we're after with any living system, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? That new things become possible. And that magic, those new possibilities, that emergent capability, is powered by life, by whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive. And we probably can never really understand what that is, and we definitely don't have to agree where it comes from, but it's important that we do acknowledge it, that there is life that is inherently self-organizing, self-generating, self-regenerating, self-integrating, integrating parts into wholeness through patterns of relationship. Because if we don't acknowledge it, then we stick with that story that says we're the ones who are making everything happen with our machines and our chemicals, or with our command and control approaches to organizations. But when we do acknowledge it, then we can step into some trust and faith and focus on creating the conditions for life to work its magic. And I say magic playfully, but to work according to its natural tendencies and patterns. We can step into the practice of stewardship, stewarding life. So I wonder if, well, let me share what I know about soil and regenerative agriculture, and then I'm going to see if Teresa and Evan in particular, if you would add what you know, what you understand, and sort of back me up or contradict me if I get something wrong. So what I've learned is that soil is made up, healthy, thriving soil is made up of wildly diverse microorganisms. And the more diverse, the better. And those microorganisms, according to, I think it's David Johnson, a soil scientist, they secrete what he calls snots, slimes, and glues. And in doing that, they, and as they move through the mineral dirt, that is not alive, dirt is not alive, they move through the mineral dirt with their secretions, they aggregate that dirt in ways that then create structures and passageways that allow water to flow in, and air and nutrients and microorganisms to flow through. It starts to create a spongy texture. That's kind of what we're after in nurturing the soil. So these microorganisms come together and create patterns and structures of relationship and interaction. And if the conditions are right, if there's enough biodiversity, enough diversity of the parts, and if they are able to create enough flow and structure to support the flow, then there's another soil scientist who talks about this phenomenon he calls quorum sensing. In human meetings, when we have a meeting and we need to make a decision, we sometimes will talk about having quorum, having enough people present that we can go ahead with our decision and take action. So kind of along the same lines, the microorganisms sense whether there's quorum, whether the conditions are right. And if they are, then they shift into this new level, this new phase in which they're no longer just a bunch of microorganisms in dirt. Now they are a living system together that we could call soil. And now they have the new capability of retaining water, and of growing plants, and of sequestering carbon. We're discovering the power of living soil, not dirt, but that whole living system of soil to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And that's a big part of why regenerative agriculture is getting so much attention now, because it has, many scientists believe, the power to reverse climate change, if only far more of the Earth's soil were regenerated. And all of this, the microorganisms and the structures and the quorum sensing and these new capabilities of growing plants and sequestering carbon and holding water, and therefore reversing or counteracting droughts and floods, and counteracting soil erosion, and reducing the need for chemical inputs and therefore chemical runoff. All of this is powered by that spark of life, right? It's self-organizing. The farmer cannot control and manage, but the farmer can create the fertile conditions for that process to be set in motion. And so that handful of methods that constitute regenerative agriculture are, for example, introducing diverse cover crops. And my understanding is that the reason for that is that all of these diverse microorganisms have different tastes. They like to be nourished by different things, and these cover crops provide different sources of nutrients. And also, in covering the soil, we protect that infrastructure that they work so hard to build. We keep it whole and intact. Another approach to regenerative agriculture is not to till the soil, not to rip it up once or many times a growing season. And the reason is they've worked so hard to build that infrastructure, and it provides useful functions. So let's leave it intact. And another is that animals, ruminants, cows, and other animals are an integral part of this system, because their manure provides even more nutrients that those microorganisms love and require in order to flourish. And there's more related to the action of their hooves and the grazing. So the reason we have those methods is that we're starting to understand how the system of soil actually works. And what excites me about this whole movement is that soil has the power to be a convening force and a teacher for many different types of people. This metaphor of soil is very powerful. People are able to understand the plight of the microorganisms and all of their hard work, and to understand that we might also come together in quorum sensing around a shared purpose or project or intention. We might sense also when the conditions are necessary. So as I'll share in the stories, the question that keeps coming up is, what would soil do? And it turns out to be a really useful question, a really useful way to bring us into the practice of stewardship. So it's a powerful convener of people in any context. It's a powerful convener of farmers and community members, because we can all recognize that soil matters to all of us, and it's becoming increasingly clear how much it matters to all of us. And it can even bring together vegetarians and ranchers who previously had nothing good to say to each other. But here we can see that those livestock have a crucial role to play in the environmental goals that many vegetarians and environmentalists care about. So that's what one of the many things that excites me about this whole movement of regenerative agriculture. All of this is transforming how we understand our role instead of driving the machine, whether the machine is an organization or a farm, or our bodies, to stewarding or gardening something precious and alive. And therefore, whatever our work, its purpose is to cultivate the fertile conditions for life to thrive. Every project is an opportunity to create a practice ground for a more thrivable world. And that's a pretty big shift. So first story I have to share is of my work with Regeneration Canada. It's a relatively young, both in age of people and duration of the organization. It's a not-for-profit organization dedicated to the regenerative soil movement. And part of my work with them early on was to help them develop their strategy to grow the movement, to support and grow the movement. And so they asked for an activity to help them map the stakeholders. And it was really difficult because everybody's a stakeholder, right? We all rely on soil to survive, and we rely on its regeneration. And so at first we had this just like a spilled plate of spaghetti. Everybody was connected to everybody, and it didn't make sense. The only way we could untangle it was to group people according to conversations that they were having. What are the conversations that are happening around soil? And in this way, we were able to create this kind of portrayal, at least, if not a map, of who the major stakeholders are. And what became clear is that there's far too much complexity across all of these stakeholders for any one organization to try to coordinate or manage. And so this is where that question first came up: what would soil do? If we can't manage it as if it's parts in a machine, how could we cultivate it? How could we steward this movement and create the fertile conditions for it to self-organize, self-integrate, self-generate? So applying those universal design principles to the movement. And so one of the answers to that question was that all of those stakeholders need to come to see themselves as one ecosystem. So let's bring them all together and help them sense, help them quorum sense, right? And help them be in patterns and structures of relationship with each other, and honor the diversity of the different contributions that each of them makes. So this was a 4-day symposium that gathered 500 people, and they represented all of those stakeholders. There were farmers of all types and sizes. There were bankers, there were nonprofits, there were policymakers, there were interested and concerned citizens. And over the course of the 4 days, the arc was towards seeing themselves as one ecosystem and coming together in shared purpose. So another kind of insight that emerged that was related to this question, what would soil do, is that any living system is by nature a learning system. To be alive is to be learning is to be alive. And this is really the work, it's at the heart of the work of regeneration. So part of the shift that they went through in seeing themselves not as drivers of the machine, but as stewards and gardeners, was to see that their leadership was really to support the learning that was needed over time, continuously over time. So to connect those different stakeholders, but in conditions of shared learning. And that was a quite profound shift. So from there, and my work with Regeneration Canada, I was eager to understand, how does this change, this transition in worldview and in practices take place at the grassroots level, at the farmer level? A lot of what I heard in the symposium was, we get this, but how do we change everybody else and make them understand and make them do things differently? And I thought, that never really works, changing somebody else. So how are farmers changing themselves? So I started to work with this group in Ontario. This is a group of 26 farmers plus a golf course and a school that came together as the Soil Health Coalition. And what they all had in common is care for regenerating the soil. The way it got started is, I think, the way many community-led projects get started. There were some women, and every good community has this type of woman or women. I think of them as the matriarchs. They got together in somebody's kitchen and they noticed there was something missing in the community. There was a need, and they figured they might as well do something about it. And the something missing that this group of matriarchs noticed was that there was nothing to bring all the farmers together, all different types of farmers in the community. The ranchers had their gatherings and the market gardeners had their gatherings, but nothing that brought everybody together. And it seemed like that was important, kind of like the hedge that you talked about, Teresa. So how do we go beyond the hedge? So they invited a soil scientist, the one who talked about the snot, slimes, and glues that microorganisms secrete in soil. They invited him to come to their town and give a talk, and it was fabulously well attended and was a big hit, so they decided to continue. And this is how the Soil Health Coalition was formed. They did things like Twilight Tours, where they would visit each other's farms, and that's not a unique thing. It happens in other places as well. But what was special was that it was all different types of farmers. Another thing that they added was an invitation to non-farming neighbors, to their citizens, to come and learn about soil regeneration and to get involved by doing soil measurements, measuring the health of the soil, how much water was being retained, and how much biomass, things like that. And 40 people volunteered, came forward, got the training, and did testing on these different farms and golf course and school. So at this point, they got funding. Their project was so successful and thriving that they got funding, and it became a formal project. And that was almost the beginning of the end. This happens, I think, pretty often, that when there's funding and formalization, we fall back into assumptions related to that mechanistic worldview. So one of the assumptions was that one person needed to be in charge and controlling and coordinating everything, and only that person. And another was that all outcomes deliverables had to be determined in advance, and that they had to be only quantitative. So the deliverables that they worked with were just related to soil health metrics. And it really became all about the metrics, and how did the metrics drive decision making on the part of the farmers. But it turned out that it really wasn't the metrics that drove the decision making between the farmers. It had so much more to do with the learning and the conversations and the relationships between them. So they were just stuck in these assumptions, and the whole project started to lose life and lose energy and interest. And so those matriarchs kind of stepped forward again and said, hold on, we're in service of the project now instead of the project being in service of us. How do we get back to the aliveness that we had when we started? And so again, we came with this question: what would soil do? And that's been helpful to challenge the assumptions and to bring the focus on to the relationships. And we talk a lot about the snot, slimes, and glues of that group and that community. And we started to talk about cultivating the soil of community. So again, it was really helpful to bring those universal design principles to their project, and it helped them reach out to more and more of the community in conversation. So here's an example of a forum where we talked the technical aspects of what we're learning about our soil, but we also talked about how do we cultivate the soil of community. And ultimately, what we came to was this powerful question: that what's really driving us, what's really creating that quorum and holding us together, is not the metrics, it's the opportunity to be in healing. Regeneration is another word for healing. So we're guided by this question: what if healing the soil and healing our relationship with soil is essential to healing ourselves, our community, and our world? And it's such a big and profound and compelling question that it draws in people from all walks of life, and yet it keeps us grounded and rooted in the soil. So as a result of this, of taking the reflection to this level, the farmers and land stewards involved have come to realize that it's really not about the methods and the metrics. Those are important, but it's about learning the language of the land. It's about learning to be in a more indigenous relationship with the land. And that's something quite personal, and that definitely requires shared learning and conversation and cultivating the soil of community to be in those conversations. So what's up next for this group now is two things. One is creating a program that will find and support and connect and train the matriarchs of any gender, but the conveners, and the community cultivators in any community across Ontario. This is taking place in the province of Ontario. So how do we create that kind of a community practice so that at a hyper-local level, these conversations can be happening everywhere? So that's one next step for the group. Another is digging more deeply into this idea of healing and healing as a reconciliation with our Indigenous neighbors and peers and fellow farmers. And that's scary and exciting and unknown, but feels important. I've been telling this story of Thrivability for 20 years, but I only discovered soil 3 years ago. And before that, I would describe those patterns in a forest or in our bodies, and it was okay, but there's something different about soil that makes it more accessible. And I don't use that metaphor yet in all contexts, but I'm really excited about it. There's something that people can understand. It's something that we all can imagine that we care about, that's relevant to all of us. It seems accessible and unifying somehow. So
as you mentioned, it's something we all have concern about.
Right.
We deal with it in one way or another. I live in an apartment, but I still have my plants, which I want them to thrive and grow.
Right. Yeah.
But even learn from the plants.
Mm-hmm. In tourism, Evan and I did a workshop for a group, a government and industry group in Northern Ireland recently, and the metaphor I used there was the difference between an orchard and a rainforest. And an orchard is tightly controlled monoculture, and has limited output, requires a lot of input and control and energy, and is very vulnerable to change in the surrounding context. But we have forests of all kinds that are millions of years old and that required no real input from us. And although there is an aspect of stewardship that we're learning about among Indigenous people, but the bounty and abundance in output is really enormous. So my invitation to them was to shift from thinking of tourism as a bunch of individual local enterprises to seeing it as a rainforest that could be brought together in quorum sensing in any one community. One of the things I hear over and over is that part of what blocks us from making this transition, or blocks farmers from making the transition from conventional to regenerative, is the culture and peer pressure from their neighbors. I had no idea, but the peer pressure is severe to keep things the way they've always been. This is the way we've always done things. And it, so that peer pressure discourages experimentation. If you're going to experiment, you're going to do it way in the back where your neighbors can't see. And so part of what we've been talking about, this farmer group, is transforming that into a learning culture where we openly share our experiments, where we're celebrated for our experiments, even if they fail, that there's no stigma. That's just fantastic. You've learned something, as long as you have some support. But people don't think things through, as you're saying, Joris, but also we try things out, you know, and then we realize, no, that doesn't work, but now we know. And I find being in the practice of trying out new things with soil kind of loosens us up so that we might apply it to our other relationships, work in organizations and in community.